Hi everyone, and welcome to this session, the virtual handshake. It's my pleasure to start the session with an introduction to my guest, Jeff Allen from Willis Towers Watson, who's kindly joined us today to first of all set the scene in terms of the phases we find ourselves in through this crisis, and then to talk a little bit about how to make a virtual meeting a success. Now, you've seen Jeff's bio, but I'll ask him to briefly introduce himself and tell us why he's passionate about the subject today before going on to his presentation. So welcome, Jeff, and over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. Great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. You know, as you mentioned, you have my bio, but I am a managing director of client management with Willis Towers Watson, a global advisory and brokerage firm working with companies around the world on human capital and risk issues. And in my role, I'm responsible for our overall partnership across all of our services with our largest clients. And in that role, needless to say, I'm involved in many different types of meetings, both phone calls, in person, and today, mostly video virtual conference calls. And so that's really accelerated my interest in this area. And I think, like many of us, it's been a journey. It's been one where there's been a lot of learnings through this, from how to set up your camera to what to say, to what background to use. Should I have a virtual one? Should I not? All sorts of different things that you never even had to think of before. And so it's been a great learning process, and I love everything that has to do with learning. So this has been no exception. So appreciate the opportunity to share at least a little bit that I've learned here. What I'd like to do is put up on the screen here and start, as you said, with this, which is a view of what we're seeing in the market. And certainly we're working with a lot of organizations around the world as they move through the stages of the pandemic. And here's what we see. And to recap, you know, first starting out when the pandemic hit was really about managing the crisis, making sure the workforce was in line with the demand, really a high focus on cash and liquidity and protecting the business, but also the employees' health and well-being and safety were very essential. So a lot of reactive, trying to stabilize things as it unfolded. And then we're seeing moving into the second phase, where we're seeing a lot of organizations starting to move or to really actively think about. But before I go on, let me say all of this is highly dependent on geography in particular and industry to some degree and where companies are. But the second stage is about thinking about how do we bring people back to office? What is working in this new environment as it stands today with the unpredictability look like? And so there's continued focus on making sure that the business is safe, is stable, but that people are safe and that the critical talent in an organization have the ability to work and really deliver on what's needed at this time. And as we look forward, there will be a phase 3, and that phase 3 is once there's a cure or a vaccine and we're past the crisis, what does operating in this new world look like? And there'll be new ways of working, new ways of thinking about things, and honestly, new opportunities, I think, for many businesses to consider and how to optimize and really run business in a different way going forward. So if I look at this next page, what does this mean from a remote workforce standpoint? And we're looking across the stages here, but I point you to the top of the page. And interestingly, if you look at remote working, prior to the pandemic, about 11% of employees were working remotely. As we moved to stage 1, right into the crisis, it increased significantly up to about 65%, not unexpected. And as we go forward, we're starting to see that pull back a little bit. It certainly will as more organizations move into stage 2 fully, but it'll pull back slightly. There's a lot of caution about going too far, too fast. And there's a lot of discussion about what does a safe work environment look like at this juncture. And as we get further along and past the pandemic, we're really expecting people to start returning back to the office, but not nearly as much as existed before. And so it's going to create a whole new environment. And almost a long way to say that all of the skills we're learning with virtual interactions are critical right now, but they're going to remain important for the long term. So it's a great time to really hone up those skills and learn about it and deploy them best you can. So if I move now, just here's a little bit of sharing around what I've learned going through this. And this isn't all of it. There's a lot more, and there's other factors that others have learned that really goes into a great virtual video. I'm really focused here on video meetings. But these are some highlights that I've taken away. And what I'd say is that, as always, with any interaction, any meeting, it all depends on the meeting dynamics. What's the purpose of the meeting? Who's participating? What's the size of the group, and so on. So it's tailored towards that, and you use your best judgment on what's appropriate in those situations. But first, and this is a bit new, I think, overall, but preparing and really getting comfortable with the technology. So we usually do spend a lot of time preparing for meetings, particularly big ones or more formal ones. But in this case, you need extra time. You really need more preparation on the timing and the roles. How are handoffs going to happen? And really a lot of time with the technology and backup plans. What happens if a key person on your team who is presenting all of a sudden at the last minute can't get audio connections? What if the video doesn't show and you can't present your materials? All sorts of things. What are your backup plans around that? Just being prepared around it. One tip that we do is when we have a big meeting that has a number of people involved with different areas of expertise, we'll make sure we share our key notes and we have a backup person to cover it if something should happen. Another is getting comfortable with the technology. There are a number of them out there: Zoom, WebEx, Skype, Microsoft Teams, and others. They work similar but a little bit different. So get comfortable with using that technology that you're going to have for that meeting, including the mute button that I'll talk about in a minute. Spend some time arranging what's on your screens, the layout of the people, who you're going to see, how they're going to show up. Where do you have your notes? Where do the materials show up? All of that is doable when you have a screen or multiple screens in a number of different ways. And then, of course, get on early, test the video and audio, get situated, especially if you're presenting. Next is, remember you're on video. So there's a lot that goes into this. Set the camera position, the background, your lighting. Do you use a background, a virtual background? Do you use your actual background? All sorts of things to figure out. There are a lot of tips online. I'd encourage you to look there. It still surprises me a little bit that when I see some videos, sometimes people are really dark or things are maybe not up to snuff a whole bunch, and there's easy opportunities to fix that. And it's a work in process for all of that. You're probably looking at mine and maybe thinking the same here. I do share this room with my son, so he's been gracious enough to allow me the use right now and to clean it up a bit. Next is maintain eye contact or lens contact. So look at or in the direction of the camera, especially when you're speaking. It helps to create a sense of connection and direct interest between listener and speaker. Another is avoid repetitive body movements. Sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. So as I might be doing right now, swaying back and forth, it can be very distracting. That's something you want to avoid. Hand gestures are fine, but you want to perhaps tone them down from what you usually may do in person, again, because they can be distracting. And then dress for the meeting. And I have here, wear pants and trousers. I had a situation recently where I had to stand up for half a second, and I got an instant message from one of my colleagues reminding me not to stand up because I had on where I would call funny shorts at the time. So dress for the meeting fully and get yourself prepared for that. Couple other aspects here. Understand what will show up on other people's screens. For example, if you're getting an instant message, will other people see it? If you're presenting and you're sending one, who will get those messages? So be very careful about that, and always take care of what you're saying depending on the audience in those messages. And then a word on your personal life. We're all operating in a different world, and we're, as one of my very good clients says, many of us are living at work. And so it's okay if if our life shows up sometimes unexpectedly, our kids, pets, our neighbor's lawnmower, all of that. And it depends on the meeting, but in many meetings, I find that it's a really good way actually for people to get to know each other on a different level. You're really inviting people into your home so much when you're using these video calls, and people get to see a more personal side of you that they don't see through the business interaction. So in that regard, it actually can be helpful in building connections with people. And then last, audience and connectivity. And this is where some of the hard part comes in, because in person, it is just more natural. You have a bigger connection. You can read the room. You can see body language. You can pick up on a lot. But in a video settings, a few things. Attention spans are shorter. Look for shorter calls, more frequent breaks, and look to build in an interactive component. Avoid monologue to the extent possible. So if you've got a meeting that's prefaced on building dialogue, gaining input, solicit feedback, use pauses, have planned interactions, things of those nature, and use the videos to gauge reaction so you can see if people are hearing, if people are engaged. Sometimes people have questions and they don't have the ability to jump in and ask it because other people are speaking before them. So look for that and see what you can do to make sure that people are engaged and they're drawn into the conversation. And that brings this next point. There's the raise hand feature and the mute buttons. For particularly large meetings, sometimes we'll set it up where it's everybody on mute, and I control whether people come on and off and ask people to raise their hands if they want to speak. And that's not good for all meetings, but some meetings that approach can be helpful. Last 2 points, look to build connection through language. This is going to be one of the more dominant ways that you're going to have to connect with people. And I'll give you a couple examples. One is the power of you and the power of we, or that's my two. The first is when you're opening up, you might say, can everyone out there hear me? Instead of saying something like that, you might be better off saying, can you hear me? And so the person feels like they're being a little bit more spoken to. If you're having a team meeting among your team, use the word we as much as possible. It brings out that feeling of team and connectivity as a group. So a couple of things to think about there. And then last, avoid reading a script. And this was a really interesting, learning that I had. And avoid appearing to be reading a script as well. So where you have your notes is important, so you're not looking down and reading from that. But if you have something scripted out, practice making it natural. Practice going through it with where you might pause, where you might bring in other types of words that are not scripted out, because we have a tendency to be actually too polished, too articulate when we're reading from a script, and it's noticeable. So those are just, again, a few of the things that I've learned, and I hope some of this has been helpful to you as well.
Thanks, Jeff. And that's a great combination of that bigger picture and where we are, if you like. And then there's very, very useful practical tips that, as you say, we really need to think about and perhaps don't think about enough. So moving on, we call this session virtual handshakes. Now I'd like to kind of consider how different cultures have different ways of greeting each other, whether for the first time or with people you've worked with for years. So in a world that's principally operating now through virtual routes, in particular across borders, now how difficult is it to, greet people appropriately, get the right tone and the right level of respect? So in the Anglo-Saxon world, a handshake is very common, but we've been talking to treasurers in Southeast Asia, and many of them find it uncomfortable. So they give, weaker handshakes, and they find strong handshakes. One of them was saying to me how they really found it strange that when they were training in New York, how they basically they were told to be quite aggressive and give a very firm handshake, but how that in their native country it just doesn't really work well. And people telling me as well, in China, for instance, that people find it uncomfortable and therefore give quite a limp handshake, and find it quite awkward between genders as well. It's not comfortable, shall we say. So I've been asking a number of treasurers about that kind of thing. And I've also been reflecting on, say, my experience in Thailand, where when you greet people, you why, and you might have different positions of why depending on the level of respect for the other person. And I'm wondering, you know, maybe now virtually that works okay, I'm not sure. Or say in Japan, you have a little bow perhaps, wondering also whether that, you know, is working for people, because it's probably quite difficult to bow when you're seated, unless you're having a standing meeting, of course. And so there's all those little things, the differences that people have. And I've been talking to people and they've been saying things about how important it is actually, you know, to get an emphasis in your voice. So you might give a little wave and a hi, or you might just be emphasizing in your voice, saying, you know, hello everyone, really great to meet you. You're using your voice as much as possible. And it's fascinating. So we've developed a habit in certain cultures anyway of when we leave the meeting, we give a wave. And of course, it seems quite absurd if we were in a physical meeting, would we actually wave at people goodbye? So those are some of the things that we are kind of talking about. And some of our treasurers are saying, you know, observing body language is really useful for them, but they're missing cues now. So they are asking their teams explicitly, can you kind of flag up to me if there's anything, because I'm not picking up those little nuances that I normally would be. And depending where your camera's positioned, of course, you know, you've already mentioned that, Jeff, are you looking into the camera, or are you looking over at your screen and you're not like looking people directly in the eye? And just as an aside, I often notice when people are working in sort of doing a virtual panel or whatever, when they think they're not on the screen, they'll often be looking down, maybe looking at their notes, whatever else. I think to think about what the other people are doing in that panel. So if somebody's presenting at that point in time, now like earlier, I wasn't sure, Jeff, whether you could see me or not, but assuming you might be able to see me, I was staring directly at my camera and I was trying to encourage you and nod and give some expression there. And I've noticed sometimes people aren't aware, so they're like this, and that poor person that's presenting, they're already looking into this kind of blank space, and the people that they can see are kind of doing something else. So it's something to really be conscious of, I think. And another thing I wanted to point out, so it's really just, and you've already covered a lot of this, Jeff, it's thinking what it's like for other people. One of the other things I was going to talk about really was, you know, how can we imagine people greeting, you know, the kiss on the cheek in France twice and in the Netherlands 3 times. And I'm going to come back to some of our guest speakers later to see what they think about that. But people are even shutting off their video feed. And I would really encourage people to keep it on, because it's really difficult to speak to a kind of a little circle or a phone number. And you don't get as much expression as if you're kind of trying to look into someone's eyes. But another angle on that is as well, if it's maybe someone in your team, if they're retreating from engagement by switching off the video always, it might just be that they've had a bad hair day or whatever. But you might also want to think, is this habitual? Is this something where there's maybe some mental health issues going on, and we need to really think about that? Yeah, I'm going to be speaking with colleagues shortly, but before doing so, I'd like to touch on a couple more related areas. So how to communicate effectively in a virtual world, and how to build virtual teams and why that's important. So starting with the virtual teams. So research confirms that the greater the diversity in teams, the more effective it is. It outperforms other teams. We know that. And diversity can take many forms. So whether we're talking about gender and ethnicity, sexual orientation or age, they're all proxies as well for difference of thought. And so, and you can break down different personality types, you can look at it in many different ways, but having a diverse team is proven to help growth and innovation. And so doesn't it make sense to cross borders and maximize your team across different backgrounds around the world? But many people I've come across have been very skeptical about, you know, working from home or having people working in a different location. And the positive effect, of course, of COVID-19 is it's demonstrating to people that it does work, that people are just as efficient and that they can benefit as long as the technology is working. So I wonder if in the future, does that mean we're actually going to see many more diverse teams working across borders? Because we know it's not so difficult now. And I really hope so, because I've had so many discussions in the past where people really weren't going there. And yet recently I was having a chat with a group of senior treasurers and they were saying, yeah, we changed our thinking, and their views have been transformed because they can see, it's like role models, you can see it works. And by using tools like StrengthsFinder, we can deliberately look at how we fill a vacancy, and being thoughtful about our team and its diversity, we won't fall into the old trap of recruiting in our own image. So it can mean challenge, seeking out difference, and you go through that cycle of forming, storming, norming, and performing. And it can be more prolonged, getting to know each other, but your results will be better. And if we can cast the net wider, of course, we'll be doing the right thing in terms of our society's demographics, but we'll also be improving business results. So I'd like to also think, it's critically important to make your environment inclusive for all. And in a virtual world, that's very important. And it's great if you can bring people together physically at least once for somebody to have an induction. And it's very important, but we can't always do that. So you perhaps need to be more creative in what you do. And one advantage, as we say, of the lockdown has been that people have got to know colleagues and clients and others, their children, their dogs, their cats and kitchens, and that's really important in terms of building a rapport and a relationship. And we wouldn't have done that before. It would have taken time to get to that level. So, one member of my team said it's like having a window into someone's kitchen. And we also see that humour is being used to break down barriers, and sometimes people are putting on backgrounds that are a bit funky, so that it just creates a little bit of lightness as an icebreaker for people to relax. The difference in time zones, different weekends, and not having to face the commute, that really makes things much more relaxed in the virtual world. So that's really, really helpful. And for parenting duties, you might not have wanted to go to an evening event, but you can join in now. So yeah, communication, so important for virtual teams. And we're seeing some things we've taken for granted we're having to rethink, but we're also being alerted to poor behaviours that we might have had previously when people weren't in the room with us. And hopefully we'll take those back to whatever office it happens to be in the future. So, people are talking about going back to the office and having A and B teams, but if half the team's at home and half the team's in the office, remember, you might leave out the team that's not in the office, and really think that through now. And leadership, probably a different type of leadership is required. So it's not a physical seat at the head of the table, it's more of a democracy. And that's interesting, you have a different tone then. And a social element, what can we do about that? Not just team quizzes and virtual drinks and so on, but I heard a vlog from Dr. Karen Blackett who's talking about Twitter replacing the kind of water cooler chat that you have. So how can we think about having those kind of water cooler chats, like maybe random social meetings between people in the team? That's something that we're going to experiment with at the ACT. And finally, on the little tips there, talking about how we can maybe use Microsoft Outlook so we can see different people's holidays and time zones and that, and make sure we don't alienate members of the wider team, because it's really, really important to do that and to empower people, spread the load. I know when I worked in British Council, I had people working in various places around the world, and other people didn't quite approve, but we had great diversity, and I could allocate different responsibilities to people where they really felt part of the whole team, and it really, really did work well. So I'd like now to turn to my guests to ask them, first of all, a little bit about their experience over the last few months, and starting with virtual handshake in their culture or cultures they've observed. What are people doing to make that greeting in the virtual world? And then secondly, what have they observed over the last 4 or 5 months, and what are their tips and tricks, if you like, and maybe the do's and the don't do's as well. So with that, I'd like to turn with great pleasure to my first guest in this part of the session, Ginny.
Hello, everyone. This is Ginny. I am the senior finance executive and the treasury executive. So I am the chartered accountant, having worked as a CFO and also the ACT Asia Pacific panel advisor. So this is my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for Caroline bringing me in. Okay, to be part of the team that talking about the virtual handshake. So talking about from the treasurer's perspective. So I am the treasurer, okay, to accomplish the a very significant syndication loan and also the M&A deals. So all these are driven by the cash flow. So that's why we have a session calling the future of cash flow forecasting in the upcoming ACT Festival of Treasury Transformation. So that is something else to broadcast, okay? We will be sharing this part of it. So back to the question of virtual handshake. Yeah, definitely this is a new, kind of again, becoming a new normal. And what we can use as a kind of like a, you know, I would say a hello, okay, everyone else as the beginning of like a conversation, because right now we have a more leverage on the technology. We have a very the scale and a very broad like audience. So sometimes okay we have used international like languages, say hello, and then that is like a common language that everyone else in different like countries, and they all understand what is it about. And if the tone of it, okay, we will have to be a little bit like a louder and also a little bit like energetic at the beginning of it in order to attract the attention of the audience. And that is something else that is the pretty of it. And also once we leverage on the technology, we can choose a kind of like a virtual background, just the one that I'm using right now. It makes it more like a dynamic and more like a breaks the ice. Yeah, and that is something else that really good to reach like and increase the engagement of like the audience. But however, to make it success, we need to make sure that like a testing upfront to ensure the hardware and software are tested for the platform, and that is well beforehand. Not only 5 minutes before meeting starts, say there is a troubleshooting live could be embarrassing, and also this is build a good habit of conducting a virtual course at least once a week, okay, with your colleagues or friends. And you can get comfortable with navigating with software and presenting from like a portable like device. So that is something else that my sharing, okay, in this location. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ginny, and great to see you from Hong Kong with your Thai background. So thank you very much for that. And we'll move over to Jose Carlos in Spain now, please.
Okay, thank you. So, I'm Jose Carlos Cuevas. I'm Vice President of the Spanish Corporate Treasury Association. And in my free time, I'm partnered at EY, taking care of cash management, working capital, and restructuring. So, right now it's funny because of the COVID and the situation we are living, and especially for Latin countries, the situation is not easy. So you all know that cash is king, and monitoring cash will be a key factor, and in fact all different corporates, and this is good for us at EY. All different corporates are taking care of the situation of their cash availability and what will happen in the coming months, because to be honest with you, nobody really is fully sure about what will be the trends and the tendency in the coming month, and what will happen with some sectors like, for instance, leisure, tourism, and so on. So it's not easy. And in terms of how we are managing our daily relationships and how we are taking care of keeping in touch with banks, with different partners, and with different treasurers in our association, it's not easy because listen, at the end of the day, we are Latin. So so we need to be close to the others. We need to share experiences. We prefer just a face-to-face meeting than a virtual meeting. And by the way, virtual meeting, you all know that we start working at 8 o'clock. We finish at 9 o'clock in the evening. We don't have time to have lunch. And it's meeting every half an hour. So it starts being more than stressing. So you know what? But nevertheless, it's true that it works. So what we have seen, and this is something that we discovered during the last 3 months, is that it's totally possible. I mean, it's totally possible, but we need to dimension the approach. But it's totally possible just to compensate the the time you are at the office with the time you can spend working at home, and meeting with partners and with customers and so on. So at the end of the day, just to take the right decision about where to work and how to work is something challenging for the coming year. So of course, technology, you discover that you have a very crucial and important meeting, and half of the people has not very good web access, and so you need to take care of all that. And last but not least, what I told you at the very beginning, if you are part of a Latin country like Spain, Portugal, Italy, and even France, at the end of the day, from time to time, you need personal meetings, having lunch with them, and closing the deal in a face-to-face meeting. So we are missing all that. Step by step is coming back. We discovered last week that in most of, let's say, the big cities in Spain, business as usual is back. So restaurants crowded, and people coming back to what they used to do a month ago. We need to be prudent. That is true. That is quite easy just to forget what has happened and to come back to your normal habits in terms of working. So we need to find the right point between the new, let's say, normal life and the previous way of working, and it's not easy. But okay, we will see. And so it will be challenging the next month.
Yeah, I can imagine very challenging, particularly for a culture where you're so reliant on those physical kind of connections, etc. But great that things are opening up. But yeah, we'll see there, because people will take some things with them from this, won't they? And it will be maybe different in the future. But there's some cultural norms that are very strong, of course, and will always remain. Well, thank you very much, Jose Carlos, for that.
You're welcome.
And I'd like to turn now to Jean-Marc, if you would like to say some words of wisdom to us, please, on those topics.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. Normally, I would say good morning or good afternoon, but I don't know when this will be watched. So that's first, I think, sometimes, which is a bit of a challenge in a virtual meeting, whether they're live or not. Yes. As a background, so I chair the European Association of Corporate Treasurers. So like everyone in the last months, I haven't met many people face to face. I've seen them virtually, but probably in a past life, I was with high-tech companies which were using a lot of those virtual meetings for years. I mean, since the 15 years ago, and I had probably too much of them, to be honest, at some point. So because they were virtual teams. So what kind of handshake? It's an interesting question, because in the real life, and I'm saying in the real life, face to face, that's what I mean. I would probably be very mindful of where I am. So when in Rome, do as the Romans do, and be maybe careful not to kiss somebody in Asia, because I would do it in France. I don't know if this would be 2, 3, or 4, because it depends on the regions in France. Definitely I would be careful in real life. I think it's a little bit different in cyberspace, because what are the rules of cyberspace? I think we set the rules and we have to be practical. So we need to be rational. I think it's interesting that you named the title of the session is a handshake. It's actually in computer communication protocols, there is a handshake that tells that the computer wants actually to talk to another. There's another thing that is also done in computer communication. It's a heartbeat. And those who trade, I mean, treasurers trade on electronic platform. There's a heartbeat that is sent very frequently to make sure there is still communication between two platforms, and that the quote that you have seen is valid. And we must do this also when we talk to people, because technological glitches happen. And it's good to verify that on the other side, people are still listening to you, seeing you, because again, we've got to be very understanding of this. People might have experienced those glitches, so let's not be upset about those glitches, and let's be natural. I think I've heard it, and I fully agree. It's good to see how the home of people, it's good to say, well, I'm sorry, I've got a problem. Say it, please say it. So that's quite important. Another important point, and I'm sure some of you have experienced, is the time zones. Yes, you know, if you're, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's an absolute killer. You know, I was for many years in working with a company based in California. The headquarters were in California. I was in Europe, was obviously dealing with Asia, but I remember getting India, Europe, and California together. It's an absolute killer. Somebody's going to be there at 3 a.m. and it's not pleasant, as you can imagine. So you've got to be very, you know, humble and accepting of mistakes of others, because ask them, do you say good morning to Jeannie or good afternoon? I have to think about it, because you don't know when it will be. So that's about the handshake part. I think, you know, do you want me to talk about the do's and don'ts as well, or?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay. So one thing which I think is very important, we all have to be super engaged, because it requires, I mean, virtual meetings require more efforts from both the organizer and the participants. Really, I mean, you know, this is super intense. I think also we've got to, I'm sorry to say that for some culture, exaggerate a little bit our emotions. You know, I'm a bit Latin, I'm French, as Jose Carlos said, so I'm a bit of north and south and so, and a bit of everything. But we need to show our emotion. It's like when people take a picture, you need to exaggerate maybe a little bit your smile, because otherwise people will not see it. So be engaged, show your emotions. Another thing is, but that's general business, be explicit rather than implicit. You know, be clear, be more clear than you would ever be, and don't assume people will hear or understand your nuances, because they will even see it less than normal, because they don't have the, you know, the other types of feedback. And I do have one thing in mind, and we all speak English in general in those meetings. I mean, English is the global language, so we speak global English, not natural or sophisticated English. We speak simple English, but some of us use, you know, habits of our own language. So I remember, for example, in France, you have, when you ask a question, you can say, do you, or you can say, you do, and then you raise your voice at the end to show or to make people understand it's a question. And you've got to be careful about this, because whether on audio or on video, people might not understand that you're actually asking a question. So you have to repeat many times and people don't get it. Other things, and which is true for conference call or video calls, if you change the subject, be super simple. Hey, I'm changing subject, or about next week's meeting, say it loud and clear. Because if you start the sentence and say at the end the subject, the new subject, you realize lost people for 10 seconds. So all these little tricks, which are, you know, simple, but be mindful and be humble. This is complicated.
Yeah, well, that's great, Jean-Marc. And I think if we think about the technology, often we have a little bit of an internet blip that you just miss that nuance, or you just miss a word. So as you say, if you're really explicit, then you help everyone to know where you are, and maybe even repeat something, and just make sure that your pace is slow enough, because, you know, when the internet breaks up, or your connection breaks up, you just miss that little subtlety and you could be lost. So it's about being inclusive, isn't it, as well? Well, thank you very much. I mean, it's been a great session to talk about this with you all. Thank you so much, Jean-Marc, Jose Carlos, Ginny, for your participation. And thanks, of course, to Jeff Allen for his fantastic presentation. And I think we'll just close, maybe I'll do the kind of classic thanks very much, and hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.